Welcome to the Scottish Rite Journal podcast, an audio presentation of the Scottish Rite Journal, brought to you by the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite, Southern Jurisdiction, Mother Supreme Council of the World. This week's article is A Complicated Enlightenment, the Empress Catherine, the Grand Duke Paul, and the Russian Freemasons by Brother James Patrick Green, 32nd degree, and comes from the May-June 2023 issue of the Scottish Rite Journal. While traces of Masonic activity are present in Russia in the early 18th century, Russian Masonic tradition holds that Peter I was himself initiated and presided over the first lodge in St. Petersburg. Russian, Soviet, and Western scholars have identified the reign of Empress Catherine II, reigned 1762 to 1796, as one of the most influential periods in the early history of Russian Freemasonry. Catherine's ascension following the orchestrated deposition and possible assassination of her unpopular husband, Emperor Peter III, placed a woman with a strong background in Enlightenment thought and ideals on the Russian throne. She regularly communicated with writers such as Diderot, Voltaire, and D'Alembert, and she sought to reform the Russian legal system to be more just. These enlightened impulses were pursued while Catherine continued to maintain a strong belief in the absolute authority of the monarch and the value of a rigid class system, including the practice of serfdom. It is amidst these two Catherinian impulses, enlightenment and absolutism, that Russian Freemasonry reached its first peak and suffered its first major repression. The foundation of organized Russian Freemasonry in this period was laid out by multiple hands, but the impact of Ivan Perfilovich Elegin cannot be overlooked. Initiated in 1750 into the English system of 3 craft degrees, Elegin oversaw the regularization and institutional development of Freemasonry during the middle of the 18th century. In 1772, the Grand Lodge of England appointed him as the provincial Grand Master for the Russian Empire, giving him the ability to grant charters to new lodges and the authority to determine regular Masonic practice in those lodges under his control. Elegin, personal secretary to the Empress and director of theater and music, would generally count among what Isabel de Madariaga terms as rationalists, drawing upon the specific knowledge of the Enlightenment. The rationalistic commitment of the Masons operating under the English system was not impervious to outside influence, however. Even under the leadership of Elegin, Russian Freemasonry was influenced by new and extant rites that were more mystical in character, such as the Messalino Rite, the rite of strict observance, and other high-degree systems. Elegin's enthusiastic reception of Cagliostro, the traveling charlatan who utilized Masonic credentials to swindle deceived audiences, largely was due to his desire to obtain alchemical knowledge like the philosopher's stone. It was within this environment of competing rites and mystical interpretations of Freemasonry that Nikolai Ivanovich Novikov was initiated in 1775. As a writer, editor, and publisher in Moscow, he operated at some distance from both the court and Elegin, capitalizing on the isolation to build a circle of supporters around himself and Johann Georg Schwarz, a professor of German and history. Novikov, Schwarz, and their supporters were able to use their Masonic connections to create and fund philanthropic and educational organizations such as the Friendly Learned Society, later renamed the Typographical Company, under Novikov's direction, which supported the translation and publication of morally edifying foreign literature for a Russian audience. Yet these philanthropic developments were not the only activities pursued by the Moscow Freemasons. Beginning in the early 1780s, Schwarz had begun to establish connections with Masonic Rosicrucian authorities in Germany, subordinate to the Duke of Brunswick. Under Schwarz's leadership, the Russian Masons organized into the Grand Chapter of the 8th Province and had their dues and degree fees funneled across the border to Prussia, the center of operations for the Rosicrucians. Nikolai Novikov inherited the leadership of the Russian Rosicrucians from Schwarz upon his death in 1784. The Empress Catherine, it must be said, was never an avid supporter of Freemasonry. In her own words, "Freemasonry numbers among mankind's greatest errors. How can they restrain from laughter when they meet each other?" Through the middle of the 1780s, Catherine herself wrote 3 plays, The Deceiver, The Deceived, and The Siberian Shaman, which were sharply critical of Freemasonry on the basis of its purportedly deceptive character and connection to charlatans like Cagliostro. These early criticisms did not go so far as to question the political loyalty of the Freemasons, whose members professed loyalty to the monarchy and who occupied high positions within the Empress's government. The situation began to deteriorate, however, when word spread that the leadership of the Moscow Masons, by then commonly called Martinists or Rosicrucians, had made repeated efforts to convince the Grand Duke Paul, Catherine's son and heir apparent, to join their brotherhood. Paul repeatedly had been put forward as a suitable male replacement for the Empress, with opposition to Catherine, and even rebels like Pugachev coalescing around the idea of Paul replacing Catherine before her death. With a royal patron, and hopefully future ruler, at the helm of their order, the Moscow Masons perhaps hoped to circumvent the suspicion and criticism of Masonry generated by Catherine and her court in St. Petersburg. While archival documentation of Paul's Masonic affiliation remains scant, the perception of courting his influence and participation was enough to arouse suspicion. The Moscow Masons' attempt at securing patronage and linking that patron to a foreign power through an opaque and secretive hierarchy would link Freemasonry fatally with subversion in the eyes of its critics. The rapidly escalating situation in revolutionary France was the final straw for the Empress and the authorities in Moscow. While Novikov's printing activities had been investigated with little effect in the 1780s, in 1792, he was arrested by the governor of Moscow on charges of printing heretical and subversive literature through the typographical company. Upon transfer to Schlüsselburg Fortress, near St. Petersburg, the questioning turned to the Rosicrucian Order's international political connections and religious ideas that, according to the interrogator, contradicted Russian orthodoxy. Sentenced to 15 years imprisonment in Schlüsselburg Fortress, Novikov stood as the emblem of the Prussian-born Empress's demand for absolute loyalty to herself and her adopted church. While Catherine was particularly harsh to Novikov and his particular strand of Freemasonry, she encouraged the leaders of competing Masonic movements gradually to disband their lodges on their own terms. By the time of her death in 1796, Freemasonry as an active, organized institution had ceased to exist. Although Paul's ascension to the throne gave Russian Masons some breathing room, especially Novikov, whom Paul released soon after coming to power, it did not result in a total rebirth of Freemasonry. The triumph of Russian Freemasonry, resulting in the initiation of the most famous authors of the Russian Golden Age, was yet to come, which we will explore in a future article in the Scottish Rite Journal. Like and share this article, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. If you wish to comment, please leave one, and as a reminder, hit the notifications bell. Any accompanying photographs or citations for this article can be found in the corresponding print edition. The Scottish Rite Journal is published by the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite, Southern Jurisdiction, Mother Supreme Council of the World. Mark Dreisenstock, 32nd degree, KCCH, Managing Editor. I'm your host, Matt Bowers.